Hi everybody, this is Jan for Chess24. Once again, we take a look at the super tournament that is currently played in the Netherlands in Wijk aan Zee. And as game of the day, I have chosen the encounter between the world champion, Magnus Carlsen, with the black pieces against the Russian teenager, 18-year-old Andrey Esipenko, who has already shown us that he's far from being cannon fodder in this field. After 7 rounds, he has the same number of points as the world champion. 4 points out of 7, 6 draws, 1 victory, 0 losses. So this is far from an easy matchup. And Carlsen, with the black pieces, has to figure out how much risk he's comfortable with against the Esipenko's 1e4. The world champion starts by playing the Sicilian defense, going for c5. And after knight to f3, he announces that he's willing to take quite some risks by playing the move to d6. This is, of course, a fully established system, usually at the highest levels, leading to the Najdorf defense, which we also see on the board in this game. But it's not Carlsen's typical choice, who prefers more often than not to play knight to c6, going for his Sveshnikov defense. But this time around he plays d6, probably thinking that should give him a better chance to create winning chances, and indeed does play the Najdorf pawn to a6. Esipenko goes for the move bishop to e2, which he had already played against Niels Grandelius earlier in this very tournament. Grandelius played pawn to e5 against Esipenko and got a comfortable position, but Carlsen chooses the move pawn to e6, keeping his pawn structure more flexible, but also occupying less space in the center, therefore a riskier choice. This is the so-called Scheveningen variation, a favorite of former world champion Garry Kasparov, who had lots and lots of games in this line in the 80s and 90s. But Magnus Carlsen has not been using this all that often from the black side. Esipenko plays a move bishop to e3, keeping his options open, does not go for the classical short castles yet. And Carlsen, once again, gunning for a fight, goes for bishop to e7. Looks like the most natural move in the world, but it's a bit of a provocation, because after bishop e7, the move played in the game, pawn to g4, gains in strength. If you're concerned about this pawn to g4, people typically start with the move queen to c7, which, for example, was played by Peter Svidler against Magnus Carlsen himself. The point being that if white now goes g4, then black can counter with pawn to d5. And using the fact that he has not yet moved his bishop to e7 in order to bring it to activity to b4 in one go. Of course, that does not mean that queen c7 solves all of black's problems here after queen d2. It's still a full-fledged theory battle. But bishop e7 is asking for g4. And Esipenko says, you know what? Ask and you shall be given. Goes for the aggressive pawn to g4. Carlsen counters with pawn to b5, once again looking for the sharpest possible position. In order to play more solidly here, black could still choose the move pawn to d5, countering in the center against the flank advance, as we were once told in the 80s and 90s, before everybody just started playing g4 and h4 in any position. Something like this looks like typical play then, after which maybe black is okay, but he can't really hope to be better. He has to make some precise moves in order to equalize, and that's not what Carlsen was looking for. On this very day, plays the move pawn to b5, but Esipenko shows that he's done his homework and puts a very powerful idea on the board. Goes pawn to g5, natural, pushing this knight away. It's pawn of g4 after all. Knight ft7, and now says, you know what? I understand you want to go b4, create counterplay, chase my knight, but I shall stop that. I will play pawn to a3. You can have this pawn, and your position will nonetheless be very dangerous. Pawn to a3, an important little subtlety here, not a novelty, but a rare move, first played by Vasily Ivanchuk in the year 2010. Just giving up this pawn, stopping the black counterplay. If white instead played, I don't know, queen to d2, black would always play b4, creating counter chances. So pawn to a3, clever. Carlsen grabs the pawn, queen to d2, and computers, modern computers, if you switch them on here, they will already tell you that white is better. They quite like this idea for white. Carlsen decides to exchange the bishops. In the stem game, the Ivanchuk against Negi game, bishop to f6 was played, which also has some things going for it, because this bishop at the very least defends one of the soft spots in the black camp on g7. But the world champion takes, queen takes, and now he has to figure out how to arrange his pieces. Because white does have long-term compensation. The pawn on g7 is weak. The pawn on d6 is weak. White can just castle queenside, then go f4, f5, or e5. Sacrifice on b5 are always looming. This is a very dangerous position. And Carlsen chooses to continue provoking a little bit with the move queen to h4. Maybe more circumspect would be a move like queen e7, then g6, and hope for the best. But Carlsen goes for queen to h4. Maybe intending to meet the move long castles with pawn to g5, clamping down on some dark squares. Esipenko would rather not allow that, and he starts with rook to g1. Once again, well played, stopping black from playing g5, targeting the g7 pawn, forcing Carlsen to play g6, because castling into it with short castles would be asking a bit much from the position. It's just too dangerous. So pawn to g6 played. Now white castles queenside, now that he stopped this g5 idea. And Carlsen sees nothing better than retreating with his queen to e7. Bit of an admission that something has not gone according to plan. More natural move would be bishop b7, but that's very well met, and I think that's what Carlsen tried to avoid. By knight to b3, targeting this pawn and threatening knight to e5. Sort of overstretching the black defenses. Queen e7, knight a5. It's just bad. It's not a great position for black. So queen e7 played. Esipenko once again shows he's in no hurry. He sacrificed a pawn, but he has tremendous initiative. Goes for pawn to f4, bishop to b7, king to b1. And black once again is facing an unpleasant choice. King b1, by the way. Wonderful restraint. Saying, I ain't in no hurry whatsoever. Black has to decide what to do. There are some candidates here. Pawn to e5 was what we debated in the live broadcast, trying to capture here and create a square on e5 for the knight. Computer is not a big fan. It says knight to b3. And if takes, queen takes, this knight once again coming to a5 is a massive nuisance for white, for black. Knight to a5, and the position remains very, very unpleasant. Other moves include short castles, which still looks somewhat desperate after h4. The attack is very, very strong. Maybe knight to c5. This is a computer move, was a prudent choice, but it's very artificial as well. Knight could get chased around. So it is a very dangerous position. Carlsen plays the most natural move. He plays knight to c6, developing a piece, challenging in the center. But the reason I listed all these alternatives first is that knight to c6 has a big tactical hole, and Andrey Esipenko goes on to exploit that. If you haven't seen the move yet, or if you just want to figure out for yourself, pause the video here, try to figure out white to move and gain a giant advantage. Can you do it? The answer is knight takes b5. Pretty typical sacrifice in these positions, but with a different twist this time around. Because after a takes b5, as black plays, the white idea is not to take on b5, after which the position would be sort of unclear. Short castles, knight takes d6, knight f6, and who knows who's better and why. It's a mess. But instead, Esipenko has spotted a very unusual double attack hidden in this position. He goes for knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and the point, queen to c3. Hitting the rook, hitting the bishop. They can't be defended at the same time. And that basically means that white gets a winning position. Black has to castle, queen takes c6. Now this pawn is falling, or this pawn. White will emerge with a pawn up and a much superior position. Bad, bad news for the world champion. Of course, he is the world champion, so he does put up a great fight here. Tries to muddy the waters. There is no great solution to his problems, however. If knight to c5, for example, queen takes d6. And the endgame is fairly hopeless for black. Takes, rook d4, followed by bishop takes b5. These 3 passes would get the job done. You can't have that. He could have played something like queen a7, but the situation remains really, really bad after bishop takes b5. So Carlsen goes for the move d5, trying to ask some questions. Esipenko, for now, has the answers. Goes e takes d5, rook fc8. That was Carlsen's idea, hoping that white plays something like queen takes b5, after which rook cb8 would all of a sudden create some real attack with these heavy pieces staring down the open files. But once again, Esipenko is ready, and he has a nice little Zwischenzug. Pawn to d6. Counterattacking against the black queen. And that queen cannot go to an active square now, because it has to keep defending the knight. So queen to d8. And now with the queen excluded from the festivities, the black attack is already a lot less dangerous. Rook cb8 played anyway, and another star move by Mr. Esipenko, not an obvious one. He plays the move queen to c4. Queen to d3 looks much more natural, because it keeps an eye on the a3 pawn, which after all, after queen c4 can get captured. But after queen d3, the clever move rook a4, intending queen to f6, all of a sudden, black has pretty serious counterplay. Rook a4 is clever, because if you start with queen f6, there's queen d4, which had to be stopped first. But this position after rook a4, not easy at all. And Esipenko wisely decides to avoid it by going for activity. He's saying, you know what, you can have the a3 pawn. I don't care. What I want to do is keep your queen boxed in. This is a very nice maneuver. Queen c4, rook takes a3, queen c7. Threatening the exchange of queens, saying, if you activate your queen, I have a little tactic. After queen f6, threatening checkmate. White would take here. Then, now that the pin is gone, take the other rook and emerge. Probably victorious with this pawn running. No real counterplay against the king. It's just a winning position. So Carlsen can't do that. He also can't allow the exchange of queens, which means he has to go passive, go queen to e8. Esipenko just keeps making very strong moves here. It's one thing to get a good position against the world champion. It's another thing to keep your cool and to convert it with excellent play so far. That's what Esipenko is doing. Rook to g5. Very nice move preparing. Bishop b5 or the rook swing to b5 or to a5. Once again, destroying all black's hopes of counter chances. Rook to a4. Playing to go here. Rook to a5. Making sure there's no business on the a file. Rook to b4. Threatening b2, b3, rook b7, queen c3. And we can see white has enough defenders in the area. Now Carlsen tries to bring his queen back into action. Queen d8, bishop f3. Once again, natural move, but based on good calculation. Because if black played the normal rook c8 now, trying to hit the queen, then there is a nice little simplification available. Because of this pin, white would win the endgame. So Carlsen goes rook b4, hits the rook. Queen c7, a theme we already know. The queen returns to this very, very unpleasant spot for black. And Carlsen decides, you know what, I can't go passive again. I have to go for a counterattack with queen to f6. If queen e8, bishop c6 would just end the game. So he goes queen f6, threatening rook takes b3. Therefore, this knight better not be taken, because this would indeed be a miracle comeback for the world champion. But it does not happen. Esipenko has spotted a way once again to simplify, pinning this rook, making sure if takes, it cannot capture here because of the rules of chess. And thereby, let's face it, winning the game. With this one rook exchange, black is just running out of options to create an attack, while the d pawn will cost white a piece. Queen f5, last trick, threatening rook takes b3. Once again, Esipenko keeps his cool. King b2 parries that threat. Rook to b5. There's no good advice to give here. If this knight moves somewhere, let's say knight c5, the d pawn just pushes forward and wins the piece. So Carlsen tries rook b5, followed by rook c5 as a last resort, targeting the c2 pawn. But once again, Esipenko is more than ready. Goes rook c1. Not only covers c2, but also prepares c3, then rook c2 to safeguard his king. And there's just nothing left to hope for. Queen takes f4, queen e8 check, king g7, pawn to d7. And Carlsen has to resign. He could give 2 spy checks, but no more than that. Check, check, rook c2. And the fun is over. This d pawn would queen. Painful, painful loss for the world champion, where yeah, it feels like everything went wrong. First, he ran into a strong idea in the opening, in a line he maybe wasn't that familiar with after. He pushed for his luck with bishop e7 and b5. He got shown this very strong pawn sacrifice with a3. Already a dangerous position to be in. Then queen h4 with hindsight probably was losing time. The queen should have gone to e7 directly because it had to return here 2 moves later. And then in a very difficult position after king b1, knight c6 was an oversight, allowing this very unusual tactic with takes, 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 queen c3. After that, Carlsen, being Carlsen, did his best to muddy the waters, ask questions, and a lesser opponent maybe would have collapsed here. But the 18-year-old Andrey Esipenko keeps his cool and, with stellar play, just wins a nice game against the world champion, which in the rankings also means that Esipenko joins the leaders on 5 points. At the time of recording, the Alireza game was not yet finished. He could very well leapfrog them and end on 5.5 because he had a good position against Hare Krishna, while Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, in the middle of the pack with 4 points out of 8. And who could have predicted that? After he wins his first game, that he would score 3 out of 7 against, on paper, inferior opposition. This is, yeah, fairly shocking for fans of the world champion. Sorry. Yeah, what is there to say? An amazing performance by Esipenko. A lot of records that probably Carlsen is not thrilled about. His first loss in Wijk since 2017, if I read correctly. His first loss to a teenager since losing to Anish Giri in whenever that was, 2011. And in general, just, yeah, a rough stretch for the world champion. We'll see if he has it in him to still join the fight for tournament victory over the last 5 games so far. Things have not been going well, and what a day for Andrey Esipenko. What a tournament. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the game of the day, and I'll see you soon.